Jamin AI. Jamin AI.
You know how sometimes you bump into something in history, maybe an old law, and you just think, huh, what on earth was that about?
Oh, definitely. Happens all the time, right? Especially
Uh,
with ancient texts like the Bible.
Exactly. And instead of just shrugging it off, we thought, why not actually, dig in,
Yeah.
try to understand the world behind those words. That's what we're doing today.
Yeah, it's fascinating because often those bits that seem strangest to us, they can unlock how people actually thought, how they saw the world. It's about being open to that different perspective.
And speaking of things that might make you go, huh, at first,
Oh,
let's talk about this idea of ritual uncleanness, specifically how it applies to menstruation in the Old Testament.
right.
You find it in Leviticus 15, verses 19 and 20. It reads, when a woman has a discharge, and the discharge in her body is blood, she shall be in her menstrual impurity for 7 days. And whoever touches her shall be unclean until the evening. And everything on which she lies, unclean. Everything she sits on, unclean. Reading that now, it can feel pretty jarring.
It absolutely can. Yeah, jarring is a good word. But for this deep dive, we really want to get past that initial sort of modern reaction.
Okay.
And try to understand the context. What were the ideas underneath? What was the point? We're using an article by Jamin Bradley, The Bible's Take on Ritual Uncleanness and Menstruation, as our guide here.
Okay, great. So Bradley's first big point, and it seems crucial, is making a clear difference between ritual uncleanness and moral uncleanness. Can you unpack that? Because I think that's key.
Absolutely. That distinction is, well, it's everything here. Ritual uncleanness wasn't about sin. It wasn't like saying someone had done something wrong or was a bad person.
Right, not a moral failing.
Exactly. It was a different category entirely. Think of it more like a temporary state. And it connects deeply to their ancient worldview. They saw God as the source of life, vibrancy, flourishing.
Okay, life. So things that we're seeing as the opposite of that, what the source calls anti-life. That's where ritual uncleanness comes in.
Precisely. But maybe anti-life isn't quite evil, more like the absence of that divine life force, or something connected to mortality.
Makes sense.
So think about the examples given. The loss of blood, like menstruation in this case, but also other bodily discharges mentioned in the source for men too, and touching a dead body.
Right. Death is the ultimate anti-life, I guess.
Exactly. So menstrual blood, which wasn't resulting in new life in that moment, was linked to this idea. Same with other discharges, and obviously a corpse represents the end of life. None of these were inherently sinful acts or states, but they were considered ritually unclean.
Okay, so if it wasn't a moral issue, what was the point? Why have these rules about temporary uncleanness? What do they actually do?
Good question. The main purpose, according to the source, was about access to sacred space. Specifically, it temporarily kept people in that state from entering the tabernacle.
Ah, the place where God was believed to dwell.
Right. So it was about maintaining the sanctity, the specialness of that space, keeping things associated with this concept of, anti-life or mortality separate from the direct presence of the source of life. It's a kind of symbolic boundary keeping.
Okay, that reframes the blood loss thing a bit. It wasn't the blood itself being bad, but its symbolism, the connection to absence of life, meant it wasn't compatible with being in that immediate holy space.
That seems to be the idea. It's about symbolic compatibility with the sacred. And crucially, it wasn't about judging the person as bad.
Right.
And remember, Bradley really stresses this. These were temporary states.
Not permanent.
No, not at all. It wasn't like being banished forever. There was usually a waiting period, maybe some ritual bathing involved, and then the person was considered clean again and could re-enter the community and the sacred space.
Okay, that gives us a much better handle on the Old Testament context. But the source also talks about a pretty major shift happening with Jesus in the New Testament. How does he change things?
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. Bradley uses this phrase. He calls Jesus the tabernacle in human form.
Wow. Okay. The presence of God walking around.
Exactly. So that Old Testament framework of keeping uncleanness away from the tabernacle, it sets the stage for something dramatic when God's presence is now mobile, interacting directly with people.
And it seems like Jesus just flips the whole thing on its head, right? The Old Testament is about separation from uncleanness to approach God's space. But Jesus seems to move towards people considered unclean.
Precisely. The source points out how Jesus, deliberately spent his time around such people, even the ones others rejected because of their ritual status. He wasn't worried about contact making him unclean.
So instead of the anti-life or uncleanness affecting Jesus.
The opposite happened. Bradley puts it like this: rather than death moving into Jesus, the forces of life moved out of him.
That's powerful. Life flowing outwards.
It really captures the shift. Contact with Jesus didn't defile him, it brought healing, restoration. Think of all the stories healing leprosy, stopping hemorrhages, conditions that absolutely made people ritually unclean.
Yeah. And the source also notes that after healing them, Jesus sometimes told them to go show themselves to the priests following the old rules. Why do that?
That's a great point. It shows he wasn't just, tearing down the old system entirely. He was fulfilling it, but also moving beyond it. By telling them to follow the rituals, he was acknowledging their traditions and ensuring they were formally declared clean, allowed back into the full life of the community. It bridged the old and the new.
That really helps tie it all together.
Yeah.
This whole picture is much clearer now. If people listening want to, go even deeper on this, does the source suggest any other places to look?
It does. Bradley recommends Dr. Michael Heiser's podcast, The Naked Bible, specifically episode 75, which covers Leviticus 12 through 15.
Okay, The Naked Bible, episode 75.
And he also mentions the Faith Life Study Bible app. Apparently it's free and has some really solid study notes on these topics.
Good resources. Okay, so to kind of wrap this up, what's the main thing we should take away from this deep dive if you had to boil it down?
I think the absolute core takeaway is that these Old Testament laws, like the ones about menstruation, were fundamentally about ritual purity and access to sacred space. They came from a specific ancient pre-scientific worldview connecting things like blood loss to mortality or anti-life, not about making moral judgments.
Right. It wasn't about saying periods are bad or shameful. It's about proximity to the divine in a very specific context.
Exactly. And that makes the contrast with the New Testament so stark.
Where Jesus, as God's presence embodied, doesn't require separation, but actually moves towards the unclean, bringing life and healing from himself.
Precisely. It signals this fundamental shift from needing physical separation to achieve ritual purity towards divine presence bringing relational connection and wholeness.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? When you understand the historical and cultural context, these things that seem just weird suddenly have a kind of internal logic.
They do.
It makes you wonder, what other ancient rules or stories might look totally different if we approached them with that kind of curiosity, trying to understand their world, not just judge them by ours? Something to chew on.
Absolutely. It really underscores why digging into the context is so important. There's usually way more going on beneath the surface than we initially assume.
Jamin AI. Jamin AI.